Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Israel Explained after a short hiatus. So I used to be doing these once every day during the war. Of course, I have an actual day job, believe it or not, I continue to do it every day, but I will continue to do them whenever there are important updates, and I'll try to keep it to at least twice a week. So that's sort of where the schedule is going to be from now on. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how I think Israel can still win this war. If you've been following this, closely, most of what I'm going to say today isn't new to you, but I'm going to put it together in a package because a lot of people keep saying this war is lost for the IDF and for Israel. That's wrong. It's not lost at all. There's plenty that Israel can do to win this war. Meanwhile, other people are being too optimistic and saying that Israel is winning the war handily, which is also incorrect. The truth of the matter is that the war right now is caught somewhere in between. Israel is winning the war tactically. It's progressing in Gaza much quicker and more effectively than anyone had expected. But strategically, it's having some serious problems because it doesn't tie that to an overarching goal. So if you ever learn military strategy, one of the things that you're taught early on is that there's a spectrum of elements in the war that are all tied together. And getting one right helps you get the other right and helps you get the next one right. So you've got your operational level and you've got your strategic level. And the tactical and operational are the military means by which you try to achieve a strategic goal. Strategic goal is the end goal of the war, and the end goal of the war ties in a higher level. So winning the war tactically is meaningless unless it forwards a strategic goal. And what we're seeing right now is a classic disconnect between the tactics and the strategy. So what Israel needs to do in order to win this war is take its amazing level and leverage them into a strategic victory. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Israel can do this, and none of the things I'm talking about is it too late for Israel to do. Israel can easily begin adopting some of these and may well begin to adopt some of these and truly win this war. So before we talk about winning the war, let's look at the two main goals of the war as formulated by the Israeli government, removing the Hamas threat and releasing the hostages. And I think that everyone can agree that those two goals are very important ones, very noble ones, and ones that Israel should pursue. There is a disagreement over which one is more important, but I think that's a little bit of a distraction. The reason that's a little bit of a distraction is because Israel can't really forward its case of getting the hostages back and increase its chances of getting the hostages back without removing Hamas, moving towards removing Hamas, in my opinion. I do buy the Israeli government thesis that the two are linked, even if the links sometimes are a bit strained and a bit tenuous. So when Israel says that military pressure will bring about the release of the hostages as well as the end of Hamas, I agree. I would add to that that Israel also needs to bring diplomatic and political pressure on Hamas in order to release the hostages and in order to remove Hamas from the Gaza Strip. And that element is currently missing from the war. And we're going to talk about how they can do that. So I think one important element in this war that most people are missing, I haven't heard anyone really discuss this, is that what Israel's trying to do right now is it's trying to control as much of the Gaza Strip as it can while controlling as few Palestinians as it can. And that's a very familiar Israeli way of approaching things. It's how Israel tried to formulate the Alon Plan in the 1990s, how to have as much territory with as few Palestinians as possible. But in this case, that's a self-defeating strategy. Because if Israel doesn't take over the areas where Palestinians are actually living, that means Hamas continues to control those areas and continues to be the governing presence in those areas. And as long as Hamas is controlling those areas, it can imagine winning a victory in Gaza. Hamas right now is imagining a moment when, thanks to a lack of strategy and thanks to the Israeli desire to release the hostages, it stops fighting and Hamas remains in power. And as long as Hamas is running the day-to-day lives of most Palestinians and collecting the aid there and is in control of the border and is also able to take in not only aid but also money and guns, Hamas is not going to surrender. They have no reason to surrender. They see winning as not dying. Like Henry Kissinger said, the guerrilla wins by not losing. And right now, they're surviving. That means that they're not losing. So, what Israel needs to do is it needs to take over all of the Palestinian people, not just all of the Palestinian land. And the reason hasn't done that is A, there's a lot of risks to the Israeli soldiers if they do so. But unfortunately, war involves a lot of risk to Israeli soldiers. And B, because that would require a plan for what everyone's been calling the day after, but that's misleading. It's a plan for the day currently. What to do with the Palestinians now so that Hamas does not control them. There's a little bit of a misunderstanding about how to govern people. There's a lot of people, especially opposed to any kind of day after plan that involves civilian administration. They say that civilian administration can only be put into place through the Israeli military. To which I say, fine, but the current Israeli structure of having tanks in the city square is not civilian administration. Someone needs to police the streets. Someone needs to administer healthcare. Someone needs to take out the garbage. Someone needs to look after sewage. Someone needs to collect taxes. The Golani soldiers aren't there to do that. They can't do that. That would take away from what they're actually there to do, which is fight Hamas. So you want the IDF to control Gaza? I'm not sure that's the best thing to do, although as an interim, that might be the way to go. But if you want to do that, you have to set up a military administration over Palestinian civilians. Israel knows how to do that. Israel did that from 1967 until the Oslo process. It had a military government that looked after the needs of Palestinians. You don't want the Palestinian Authority back? Egypt and multinational Arab forces back? Fine. Instill Israeli administration. I think that would be a lot better than what we have now because it would show Hamas that Israel is serious about staying and therefore make it more likely to surrender. And a civilian administration is a first step towards permanent solution. Israel can then look to the international community and say, okay, we're running things, and we're going to give up running things only if our demands are met, which are A, B, and C. And Israel has a lot of things that it needs met. For example, it needs to remove UNRWA completely from the area. It needs to make sure that the new Palestinian state or administration is demilitarized. It needs to make sure that the government is either a very reformed PA or not the PA at all, a much better government. Israel has demands that needs to be met. If it's governing Gaza, it has the leverage to make those demands. Right now, when it seems to be scared to take over Gaza and the people of Gaza, it can't make those demands. And as long as the people of Gaza are not under Israeli control or a third body's control, they're under Hamas control. And that means they're still the government. And that means they're still distributing aid. And that means they're still collecting taxes. And that means they can still draft volunteers. And that means that they're the government and they can still win. Um, Once there's a government, Hamas will feel. Once there's a civilian government or a third party government, Hamas will feel pressure to return the hostages. Hamas will feel pressure to surrender. And also, once Israel has every inch of territory in the Gaza Strip, regardless of whether Palestinians are there or not, Hamas operatives won't be safe anywhere. They won't be able to feel like they can get away from the military. That also puts pressure. And that also makes it more likely that the hostages are released and that they surrender. Right now, all Israel is doing is waiting for Hamas to give terms on the hostages. That is a loser strategy. Israel has the initiative militarily. It needs to also take the initiative diplomatically and strategically. Now, what about U.S. support and international support? The U.S. is not going to support Israel taking over Rafah and taking over Philadelphia. It doesn't want Israel to do that. Israel needs to do that anyway. In my opinion, in order to get American approval to do so, Israel should give American concessions in places that benefit it anyway. Increasing humanitarian aid, which would not be a problem anymore if Israel is distributing it. Um, Talking to them about a political horizon for the day after. saying that a Palestinian state is possible if there are certain conditions fulfilled, like I talked about. All of those things are things that Israel should be giving concessions on because it benefits Israel. Meanwhile, in return, it should get the permission to take over Rafah, to take over Philadelphia, and to continue to pursue Sinwar and the other heads of Hamas until they are defeated, surrender, and release the hostages. That way, Israel can continue to enjoy U.S. support um, while pursuing its goals efficiently. And of course, that also requires fixing relations with the United States as much as possible because right now they're almost at crisis point. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Fortune favors the bold, especially at war. And Israel has been bold militarily, but it also needs to be bold diplomatically and politically. And if it does all that, it can win, and it can win big, and it can change the dynamic in the region in its favor. Okay, so that's the end of my little speech. Now let's take some questions. Question number one. FRDZ4KB asks, wouldn't the US, UK, EU recognizing a Palestinian state have a calming effect on Israeli politics? The fight would move from the toxic allow a Palestinian state versus annex Gaza West Bank to a far more mundane question of how to navigate the new reality that there is now a recognized Palestinian state. It would remove the illusion that there's a world where the Palestinians can be removed. That's a good question, but also I think a little bit naive. Israeli political opposition to a Palestinian state isn't very practical. It's much more ideological, and it also has to do with outflanking rivals politically and getting votes. So if the international community says we recognize a Palestinian state, that allows a lot of political actors like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and probably also Netanyahu to say, um, all these foreigners are anti-Semites and they're betraying us, and I will stand up for Israel's principles and never allow a Palestinian state. And while the entire world can recognize a Palestinian state if they want to, if Israel doesn't allow it to function, there's not going to be a functioning Palestinian state. But of course, the price to that would be increased diplomatic isolation of, of Israel. If they end this war by refusing to move towards a Palestinian state and preventing one against the will of the international community, that's going to have some serious effects down the road on Israel's diplomatic standing, which is why I think Israel should make concessions on that. I also think a two-state solution favors Israel in the long term anyway. But no, it's not going to have a calming effect on Israeli politics. Israeli politics are not calm. Very few things have a calming effect on them. Fred Aaron asks, close friend of the show, I know that you've been advocating for the IDF to seize Rafah and the Philadelphia corridor. Why has Israel resisted this? How would Egypt respond? Why does the U.S. currently oppose this move? Okay, great question. Why does Israel oppose this? Well, I think it's stupid that it does. The IDF wants to go in, but there are a few problems. Problem number one is probably Egypt. Egypt is threatening that there'll be a major crisis with Egypt. What Egypt is concerned about is not so much what happens to Rafah, because, you know, they didn't care what happened to the other cities all that much. They're worried that what happens in Rafah will cause a humanitarian crisis, a refugee crisis that'll force them to open their borders due to international and Arab pressure, and then bring in a bunch of Palestinians, including Hamas and other terrorists, into their territory, into Sinai, which they already have trouble with as a base for terrorism. Israel can't fully alleviate these concerns, but it can do something. What it should do, in my opinion, is tell the people in Rafah to evacuate back to areas that it's starting to restore in a humanitarian manner. And that requires, again, a civilian administration. So you put a civilian administration in a few cities in Gaza, Gaza City being the most one, and you start allowing people to move back home in a controlled way and in a way that guarantees them the services they need to survive and ultimately thrive. That way, people move out of Rafah. Rafah becomes less crowded, and Israel can move in after having evacuated most of the population, and it can operate there the way it's operating in Khan Yunis, despite the fact that there's still people living in Khan Yunis without causing a massive refugee crisis. The U.S. opposes this move for two reasons. It doesn't see that Israel is militarily able to achieve its goal. It doesn't want problems with Egypt. So at this point, the US wants the operation to shut down. What Israel needs to do is what I said before. It needs to come to an agreement with the United States that will move towards a Palestinian state in Gaza and help them achieve their diplomatic goals with Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis Iran in exchange for the room to finish this military maneuver properly. And the other reason they're not doing it is what I said before. Israel doesn't want to control all these Palestinians, and that's a phobia it's going to have to get over if it wants to win this war. JDB316 asks, why does Israel keep giving up convicted terrorists to get hostages back, let alone at ratios very heavily in Hamas's favor? Doesn't that reward Hamas and others for taking the hostages? How does that help Israel? Also, can you see Netanyahu and co caving on Gaza to get the hostages back, then blaming the US and other Western countries for doing so? And would that be enough to save him politically? Okay, so we have two basic questions here. First question is, why does Israel keep making these terrible deals with Hamas? And the other is, um, might Netanyahu cave and then blame it on the US? And would that help him politically? So, starting with the first one, Israel keeps making these deals because hostages are either its Achilles heel or its strength, depending on how you look at it. So, from a purely military strategic perspective, which is usually what I take here in this channel, it's a terrible mistake. Israel is encouraging Hamas to take more hostages by giving them so many terrorists. The terrorists Israel releases then inspire the next wave of violence, which is invariably worse than the last one. It is just a very bad deal to make. Um, but Israel is also built on a certain strength of what Israelis call arvut hadadit, which is that people are there for each other, that we guarantee each other's safety and prosperity in Israel, that soldiers or civilians, we're all united and together in this, no man left behind, that kind of attitude that's been at the core of Israeli solidarity that's helped it defeat the Arab states and terrorist organizations over the years. One of the things that has made Israel so strong, it's not really guns and bombs. It's that Israelis are there for each other, that there's a certain social cohesion. That's also why the events of the judicial reform were so dangerous for Israel. They were undermining that social cohesion. And this element with the hostages really brings that back. So there is another side to it. Having said that, I still think that these very lopsided agreements are a terrible mistake, but that's because I look at it mostly from a strategic point of view. Might Netanyahu and co cave on Gaza to get the hostages back, blaming the US? Yes. Right now, Netanyahu still thinks that he can win this war militarily. He may be right, especially if he follows my advice, of course. But if he starts feeling like he can't, then he would be very tempted to make a hostage deal that would end the entire war, while, having some caveats and some attempt to save face. He would immediately then turn and blame the United States for it, which would cause a crisis with Biden and other Western countries. Would that be enough to save him politically? I don't believe it. I think that if he is responsible for October 7th and then can't remove the Hamas threat, he will be gone. And I think most likely he'll be gone no matter what he does. But that will, I think, guarantee that he will be gone. But he'll try. And Netanyahu has always proven that he does better at trying to save his skin than anyone gives him credit for, or anyone has the belief that he can do. So he will try to do that. I just don't think it'll succeed. Ian, also close friend of the show, asks, with the West looking to recognize a two-state solution post the war, could Biden post-November impose a settlement that is recognized by the international community in the absence of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement that neither are willing to do, neither are willing to compromise? Biden might try to do that. There are a lot of moving parts here. So basically, whether Biden wins the elections in November or not is a very important element here. History has shown repeatedly that when lame duck presidents try to come up with some plan or impose, which they've done several times, it doesn't work. No one takes a president who's lost seriously. So if he tries to do something after November when Trump is about to come in, it'll make some headlines and everyone will ignore it because they'll be waiting to see what Trump does. If Biden wins, that's a whole different story. once he does that, if he recognizes a Palestinian state, that puts Israel in a very difficult position. They then have to face 4 years the U.S. recognizing a Palestinian state. That won't make Netanyahu move towards it, but if it's Gantz or someone else, it could make them do that. If it's Netanyahu and he doesn't do that, that will increasingly wear and tear on U.S. Israeli relations with the Democrats still in power. But as I've also said, the U.S. can't really impose a Palestinian state on Israel. It can always say that, and that puts diplomatic pressure. Israel ultimately determines whether there's going to be a Palestinian state or not. Okay, so that's it for our video today. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. That's Shael Media on Patreon. And my podcast on the history of the land of Israel. I'm working currently on an episode on the 12 tribes of Israel. Check out the podcast if you're interested in that. And I will see you again very soon.